Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, click like now so you don't fall asleep without supporting this content, and so YouTube delivers more videos like this to you. You are about to enter a calm and fascinating journey about the most intriguing queen who ever lived, Cleopatra. Everything presented in a light, fluid way, perfect to accompany your night, your rest, or that moment when you just want to relax while learning something truly interesting. This video was created to transform curiosity into mental peace. Here, you'll discover little-known details about one of the most fascinating and influential queens in history. Facts about everyday curiosities, cultural secrets, and key moments that shaped the world. All narrated in a calm, measured, hypnotic, and informative way, so you can absorb knowledge even with your eyes closed. Because learning can be simple, pleasurable, and silently transformative. And before we continue, how is your mind today? Are you tired? Looking for focus? Trying to sleep, but with racing thoughts? Maybe you just want peace while discovering something new? Whatever your situation, this video will accompany you to the end. No pressure, no anxiety, just pure and light knowledge. So take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin our journey through the true history of Queen Cleopatra. The world before Cleopatra. In the year 69 BCE, the Mediterranean world was changing rapidly. Egypt, once the most powerful civilization on earth, was now a shadow of its former glory. The Great Pyramids had already stood for over 2,000 years. The pharaohs of old were distant memories. But in Alexandria, the gleaming capital of Ptolemaic Egypt, a child was born who would change everything. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator. The city of her birth was remarkable. Alexandria wasn't like the ancient Egyptian capitals of Memphis or Thebes. It was a Greek city, built by Alexander the Great's generals after his death. Marble temples stood alongside Egyptian shrines. Greek philosophers debated in the forums, while Egyptian priests conducted ancient rituals in the temples. The famous Library of Alexandria held over 500,000 scrolls. Scholars from across the known world came to study there. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships into the harbor. It stood over 100 meters tall, visible for miles out to sea. The Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries. They were descendants of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most trusted generals. When Alexander died in 323 BCE, his vast empire was divided among his commanders. Ptolemy took Egypt, but the Ptolemies were Greek, not Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They worshipped Greek gods alongside Egyptian ones. They saw themselves as the inheritors of both Alexander's Greek legacy and the ancient pharaonic tradition. For generations, the Ptolemaic rulers had married within their own family to keep the bloodline pure. Brothers married sisters. Uncles married nieces. This practice, though shocking to modern minds, was rooted in ancient Egyptian pharaonic tradition. The original pharaohs had done the same, believing it preserved divine blood. Cleopatra's father was Ptolemy XII Elites, which means the flute player. He earned this nickname because he loved music and often played the flute at parties. But he was not a strong ruler. Egypt was in debt to Rome. The Egyptian people didn't respect him. He was forced into exile when Cleopatra was still a child. A remarkable education. From her earliest years, Cleopatra received an extraordinary education. While most royal women of her time learned basic reading and household management, Cleopatra studied like a scholar. She learned mathematics from the finest tutors. She studied astronomy and could chart the movements of the stars. She learned philosophy, debating the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. She studied rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking that was so valued in the ancient world. But perhaps her most remarkable skill was languages. While her Ptolemaic ancestors had refused to learn Egyptian, considering it beneath them. Cleopatra was different. She became the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to speak Egyptian fluently. But she didn't stop there. Ancient historians tell us she spoke at least 9 languages. Greek and Egyptian, certainly, but also Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, Ethiopian, Median, Parthian, and Latin. In a world before translators were common, this ability was a superpower. She could negotiate directly with foreign ambassadors. She could read diplomatic letters without intermediaries. She could speak to common Egyptian farmers and Greek merchants alike. The young princess. As a young girl, Cleopatra witnessed the instability of her father's reign. She saw how Rome, the rising power of the Mediterranean, could make or break Egyptian rulers. She learned that survival required intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to make powerful allies. When she was about 14, her father finally regained his throne with Roman help. But the price was steep. Egypt went deeper into debt to Rome. The arrangement made one thing clear. Egypt's independence hung by a thread. Cleopatra watched and learned. She understood that the old ways of ruling were not enough. Egypt needed a ruler who could navigate the dangerous waters of Mediterranean politics. A ruler who could deal with Rome as an equal, not a subject. She would become that ruler. The death of Ptolemy XII. In 51 BCE, when Cleopatra was 18 years old, her father died. According to his will, Cleopatra and her 10-year-old brother Ptolemy XIII were to marry and rule together as co-regents. This was the Ptolemaic tradition. But Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a child. From the moment she took the throne, Cleopatra made bold moves. She issued coins with only her image. She dated official documents with only her regnal year, ignoring her brother entirely. She made it clear who was truly in charge. The court advisors who surrounded young Ptolemy XIII were alarmed. They had expected to control Egypt through the boy king. But his older, smarter, more charismatic sister was outmaneuvering them at every turn. Within 3 years, they would drive her from the throne. But Cleopatra would return with an army, and with the help of the most powerful man in the world. The rise of Rome. To understand Cleopatra's story, we must understand Rome. By the time Cleopatra was born, Rome had transformed from a small city-state into the dominant power of the Mediterranean world. Roman legions had conquered Gaul, Spain, Greece, Asia Minor, and much of North Africa. Only Egypt remained truly independent in the eastern Mediterranean. And even Egypt's independence was more theoretical than real. But Rome itself was changing. The old republic, with its senate and consuls, was dying. Powerful generals were competing for supreme power. The 1st century BCE was an era of civil wars, political assassinations, and military coups. 3 men dominated Roman politics during Cleopatra's youth: Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Julius Caesar. They formed an unofficial alliance called the First Triumvirate, agreeing to share power rather than fight for it. But alliances based on ambition are fragile. When Crassus died in battle in 53 BCE, the partnership collapsed. Pompey and Caesar, once friends and allies, became bitter rivals. Civil war in Egypt. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Cleopatra's conflict with her brother's advisors was coming to a head. The court officials, led by the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the rhetoric teacher Theodotus, convinced young Ptolemy XIII to expel his sister from Alexandria. In 48 BCE, Cleopatra was forced to flee to Syria. She was 21 years old and had lost everything. But Cleopatra was not one to accept defeat. In Syria, she began raising an army. She recruited soldiers, gathered supplies, and prepared to take back her throne by force. She was marching toward Egypt when news arrived that would change everything. Julius Caesar, fleeing from Pompey's forces, had landed in Alexandria. The Roman civil war had come to Egypt. Enter Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of Pompey, but Pompey never made it to shore. Ptolemy's advisors, thinking to win Caesar's favor, had Pompey assassinated as he stepped off his ship. They presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar was not pleased. Whatever his differences with Pompey, the man had been a consul of Rome, his former ally, and even his son-in-law. This murder of a Roman official on Egyptian soil was an insult to Rome itself. Caesar installed himself in the royal palace. He announced that as a representative of Rome, he would arbitrate the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII. Both were summoned to appear before him. But there was a problem. Cleopatra was outside the city with her army. Ptolemy's forces controlled Alexandria. If she tried to enter openly, she would be arrested or killed before ever reaching Caesar. Cleopatra needed a plan. The famous meeting. What happened next became one of the most famous moments in ancient history. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself rolled up inside a carpet. Her loyal Sicilian friend, Apollodorus, carried the carpet into the palace and unrolled it before Caesar. Out stepped Cleopatra. Other ancient sources say it was a bedroll or a large sack for linens, not a carpet. The details vary, but the essence remains the same. Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's presence, bypassing all the guards and officials who would have stopped her. The audacity of the act impressed Caesar immediately. Here was a woman willing to risk everything on a bold gamble. A woman who thought like a strategist and acted like a soldier. Caesar was 52 years old. Cleopatra was 21. He was the most powerful man in the world, battle-hardened, politically brilliant, and reportedly one of the greatest military minds in history. She was a deposed queen fighting for her throne. They talked through the night. Cleopatra spoke to him in Latin, a language few Egyptians bothered to learn. She charmed him with her wit and intelligence. She explained her vision for Egypt. She made her case for why she, not her brother, should rule. By morning, Caesar had made his decision. He would support Cleopatra. The Alexandrian War. Ptolemy's advisors were furious when they discovered Caesar was siding with Cleopatra. They believed they had secured Caesar's favor by killing Pompey. Now he was backing their enemy. They stirred up the citizens of Alexandria against the Romans. What began as political maneuvering quickly escalated into open warfare. Caesar and Cleopatra found themselves besieged in the royal palace, surrounded by hostile forces. This conflict, known as the Alexandrian War, lasted for months. Caesar's forces were outnumbered, trapped in a hostile city. At one point, Caesar had to swim for his life when Egyptian forces attacked his ship in the harbor. According to legend, he held important documents above his head with one hand while swimming with the other. During the fighting, a fire broke out that spread to the docks where many scrolls from the Library of Alexandria were stored. Thousands of irreplaceable texts were destroyed. The exact extent of the damage is debated by historians, but it was a cultural catastrophe regardless. Eventually, Roman reinforcements arrived. The siege was broken. Ptolemy XIII fled, but drowned in the Nile when his overloaded boat capsized. He was just 15 years old. Cleopatra had won. Queen and consort. Caesar installed Cleopatra back on the throne. To maintain the appearance of Ptolemaic tradition, she was married to her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12 years old. But everyone knew where the real power lay. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers. The relationship was partly political, partly strategic, but the ancient sources suggest genuine affection as well. Caesar stayed in Egypt for months, far longer than his military situation warranted. They took a cruise up the Nile together, traveling in luxury on a magnificent ship called a Thalamigos. It was essentially a floating palace with multiple decks, dining rooms, bedrooms, and gardens. They visited ancient temples and monuments. Caesar saw the Egypt that existed beyond Alexandria, the ancient land of the pharaohs. In 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy 15 Philopator Caesar, but everyone called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Cleopatra declared that Caesar was a father. Caesar never officially acknowledged the boy as his son, which was politically impossible since he was already married to a Roman woman, and acknowledging a foreign child would have caused scandal in Rome. But he didn't deny it either. The visit to Rome. In 46 BCE, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She arrived in magnificent style, bringing her young son, her brother husband Ptolemy XIV, and a large entourage. Caesar installed her in one of his villas across the Tiber River. He showered her with honors. He placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess he claimed as his ancestor. This was an extraordinary honor, effectively declaring Cleopatra semi-divine. The Roman people were fascinated and scandalized in equal measure. They had never seen anything like her. She dressed in the traditional garb of Egyptian pharaohs. She presented herself as a living goddess, the incarnation of Isis. Many Romans were also deeply uncomfortable. Rome had a tradition of republican simplicity, at least in theory. Kings were despised. The word rex king was almost an insult. Yet here was Caesar, acting like a monarch, with his foreign queen at his side. Cleopatra stayed in Rome for about 2 years. She witnessed Caesar's triumph over his enemies. She saw him accumulate more and more power, becoming dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. But she also saw the growing resentment. Roman senators muttered that Caesar wanted to become king. There were rumors he planned to move the capital to Alexandria, whispers that he would divorce his Roman wife and marry Cleopatra, making her queen of Rome. The Ides of March. On March 15th, 44 BCE, everything changed. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who claimed they were defending the Republic. They stabbed him 23 times on the floor of the Senate. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She had lost her most powerful ally. She had lost her lover. Her son had lost his father, acknowledged or not. Rome descended into chaos. Caesar's assassins claimed they had saved the Republic, but most Romans saw it as murder. Caesar had been popular with the common people. His death triggered another round of civil wars. Cleopatra knew Egypt was in danger. If Caesar's enemies won, they might come after her. She quickly left Rome and sailed back to Alexandria with her son. She needed new allies. She needed to navigate this new Roman political landscape, and she needed to secure Egypt's independence in a world that was more dangerous than ever. Her greatest challenges still lay ahead. Return to Alexandria. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt in 44 BC, she found herself in a precarious position. Caesar was dead. His assassins controlled Rome. Egypt's protection was gone. But Cleopatra had learned much from her time in Rome. She understood Roman politics better than perhaps any other foreign ruler. She knew the assassination would lead to civil war. And in civil wars, there are opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Shortly after her return, her brother husband Ptolemy XIV died suddenly. Ancient sources suggest he was poisoned, though they don't explicitly accuse Cleopatra. With his death, she elevated her 3-year-old son Caesarion as her co-regent. For the first time, Cleopatra ruled with no adult male relative to share power. She was Egypt's sole effective ruler, and she would prove to be one of the most capable administrators in Ptolemaic history. The Pharaoh Queen. Cleopatra understood something her Greek ancestors had forgotten. Egypt was not just a territory to be exploited. It was an ancient civilization with its own traditions, religions, and cultural identity. While her Ptolemaic ancestors had remained Greek in language, culture, and religion, Cleopatra embraced her role as an Egyptian pharaoh. She participated in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies. She traveled throughout Egypt, showing herself to her subjects. She had herself depicted in traditional pharaonic regalia on temple walls. She also supported the ancient Egyptian priesthoods, funding temple repairs and construction. This wasn't merely political calculation. The temples were the administrative centers of Egypt. The priests managed vast estates, collected taxes, and distributed grain. By supporting them, Cleopatra strengthened her own power base. In the Temple of Dendra, there's a famous relief of Cleopatra making offerings to the goddess Hathor. She wears the traditional regalia of a pharaoh, including the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her son Caesarion stands behind her, depicted as a pharaoh as well. These images send a message. Cleopatra was not a Greek queen ruling over Egypt. She was Egypt itself, the living embodiment of the land and its traditions. Economic mastery. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Its grain fed not only its own people, but also much of Greece and Rome. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited nutrient-rich silt across the farmland, making Egypt exceptionally fertile. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth was its greatest asset. She managed the economy with remarkable skill. She reformed the currency, stabilizing its value. She controlled grain distribution to prevent hoarding and price manipulation. She developed new trade routes, expanding Egypt's commercial network. The royal monopolies were strictly enforced. Oil production, papyrus manufacture, and textile production were all state-controlled industries. The profits flowed into the royal treasury, giving Cleopatra the resources she needed for her ambitious projects. She also invested in infrastructure. New irrigation systems were built to maximize agricultural output. Harbors were expanded to accommodate more trade. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria was maintained and improved. Ancient documents show Cleopatra personally reviewing tax policies and economic regulations. She wasn't merely a figurehead. She was an active, engaged administrator who understood the details of governing. The visit to Rome. In 46 BCE, Caesar invited Cleopatra to Rome. She arrived in magnificent style, bringing her young son, her brother husband Ptolemy XIV, and a large entourage. Caesar installed her in one of his villas across the Tiber River. He showered her with honors. He placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the goddess he claimed as his ancestor. This was an extraordinary honor, effectively declaring Cleopatra semi-divine. The Roman people were fascinated and scandalized in equal measure. They had never seen anything like her. She dressed in the traditional garb of Egyptian pharaohs. She presented herself as a living goddess, the incarnation of Isis. Many Romans were also deeply uncomfortable. Rome had a tradition of republican simplicity, at least in theory. Kings were despised. The word rex king was almost an insult. Yet here was Caesar, acting like a monarch, with his foreign queen at his side. Cleopatra stayed in Rome for about 2 years. She witnessed Caesar's triumph over his enemies. She saw him accumulate more and more power, becoming dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. But she also saw the growing resentment. Roman senators muttered that Caesar wanted to become king. There were rumors he planned to move the capital to Alexandria, whispers that he would divorce his Roman wife and marry Cleopatra, making her queen of Rome. The Ides of March. On March 15th, 44 BCE, everything changed. Julius Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators who claimed they were defending the Republic. They stabbed him 23 times on the floor of the Senate. Cleopatra was in Rome when it happened. She had lost her most powerful ally. She had lost her lover. Her son had lost his father, acknowledged or not. Rome descended into chaos. Caesar's assassins claimed they had saved the Republic, but most Romans saw it as murder. Caesar had been popular with the common people. His death triggered another round of civil wars. Cleopatra knew Egypt was in danger. If Caesar's enemies won, they might come after her. She quickly left Rome and sailed back to Alexandria with her son. She needed new allies. She needed to navigate this new Roman political landscape, and she needed to secure Egypt's independence in a world that was more dangerous than ever. Her greatest challenges still lay ahead. Return to Alexandria. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt in 44 BCE, she found herself in a precarious position. Caesar was dead. His assassins controlled Rome. Egypt's protection was gone. But Cleopatra had learned much from her time in Rome. She understood Roman politics better than perhaps any other foreign ruler. She knew the assassination would lead to civil war. And in civil wars, there are opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Shortly after her return, her brother-husband Ptolemy XIV died suddenly. Ancient sources suggest he was poisoned, though they don't explicitly accuse Cleopatra. With his death, she elevated her 3-year-old son Caesarion as her co-regent. For the first time, Cleopatra ruled with no adult male relative to share power. She was Egypt's sole effective ruler, and she would prove to be one of the most capable administrators in Ptolemaic history. The Pharaoh Queen. Cleopatra understood something her Greek ancestors had forgotten. Egypt was not just a territory to be exploited. It was an ancient civilization with its own traditions, religions, and cultural identity. While her Ptolemaic ancestors had remained Greek in language, culture, and religion, Cleopatra embraced her role as an Egyptian pharaoh. She participated in traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies. She traveled throughout Egypt, showing herself to her subjects. She had herself depicted in traditional pharaonic regalia on temple walls. She also supported the ancient Egyptian priesthoods, funding temple repairs and construction. This wasn't merely political calculation. The temples were the administrative centers of Egypt. The priests managed vast estates, collected taxes, and distributed grain. By supporting them, Cleopatra strengthened her own power base. In the Temple of Dendra, there's a famous relief of Cleopatra making offerings to the goddess Hathor. She wears the traditional regalia of a pharaoh, including the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her son Caesarion stands behind her, depicted as a pharaoh as well. These images send a message. Cleopatra was not a Greek queen ruling over Egypt. She was Egypt itself, the living embodiment of the land and its traditions. Economic mastery. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. Its grain fed not only its own people, but also much of Greece and Rome. The annual flooding of the Nile deposited nutrient-rich silt across the farmland, making Egypt exceptionally fertile. Cleopatra understood that Egypt's wealth was its greatest asset. She managed the economy with remarkable skill. She reformed the currency, stabilizing its value. She controlled grain distribution to prevent hoarding and price manipulation. She developed new trade routes, expanding Egypt's commercial network. The royal monopolies were strictly enforced. Oil production, papyrus manufacture, and textile production were all state-controlled industries. The profits flowed into the royal treasury, giving Cleopatra the resources she needed for her ambitious projects. She also invested in infrastructure. New irrigation systems were built to maximize agricultural output. Harbors were expanded to accommodate more trade. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria was maintained and improved. Ancient documents show Cleopatra personally reviewing tax policies and economic regulations. She wasn't merely a figurehead. She was an active, engaged administrator who understood the details of governing. The Nile and its rhythms. The Nile was the lifeblood of Egypt. Every summer, the river would flood, covering the field with water and silt. When the waters receded, farmers would plant their crops in the newly enriched soil. Without the flood, there was famine. The flood was measured using nilometers, structures built to track the water level. Priests would record the measurements and predict the harvest. If the flood was too low, there wouldn't be enough water for crops. If it was too high, it could destroy villages and infrastructure. During Cleopatra's reign, the Nile floods were generally favorable. This wasn't luck. Egyptian engineers had spent millennia perfecting systems to manage the flood. Canals directed water to distant fields. Reservoirs stored excess water for dry periods. Dikes protected settlements from overflow. Cleopatra invested in these systems, ensuring they were maintained and improved. A well-managed Nile meant prosperity, and prosperity meant stability, which Egypt desperately needed in these turbulent times. Cultural flourishing, despite the political turmoil of the era, or perhaps because Cleopatra understood that culture was part of Egypt's power, her reign saw a flourishing of arts and learning. The Library of Alexandria, though damaged in the fire during the Alexandrian War, was still the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Scholars continued to work there, copying texts, conducting research, and advancing knowledge in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Cleopatra herself was a patron of learning. She sponsored scholars and philosophers. She collected books and manuscripts for the library. Ancient sources describe her debating philosophy with visiting intellectuals. The Museum of Alexandria, which was essentially the world's first research institution, continued to receive royal support. Scientists there made advances in anatomy, optics, and engineering. They calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. They studied the stars and improved maps of the known world. Egyptian art also flourished. Temple construction continued. Statues were carved. Elaborate tombs were built. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian styles that characterized the Ptolemaic period reached new heights of sophistication. Religious diplomacy. Religion in Ptolemaic Egypt was complex. The Greek population worshipped the Olympian gods. The Egyptian population followed the ancient deities. And there were Jewish, Syrian, and other communities with their own religions. Cleopatra navigated this religious landscape with skill. She participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, presenting herself as the embodiment of Isis, the most important goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. Isis was associated with motherhood, magic, and wisdom. By identifying with Isis, Cleopatra connected herself to these powerful concepts. But she also supported the Greek cults. She made offerings at Greek temples. She participated in Greek religious festivals. She presented herself as descended from the gods of Olympus. This wasn't hypocrisy. In the ancient world, religious identity was more fluid than modern people often realize. One could honor multiple gods without contradiction. Cleopatra understood that religion was a tool of statecraft. By honoring all the gods, she honored all her subjects. The Jewish community. Alexandria had a large Jewish community. They had their own quarter in the city and their own religious practices. Unlike some rulers who persecuted religious minorities, Cleopatra maintained good relations with the Jewish population. Ancient Jewish sources speak favorably of her. She granted the community autonomy in their religious affairs. She didn't force them to participate in Egyptian or Greek religious ceremonies. This tolerance strengthened her position. The Jewish community became loyal subjects, contributing to Egypt's economy and stability. This approach was pragmatic, but also showed Cleopatra's understanding of effective governance. A ruler who respects her subjects' beliefs earns their loyalty. A ruler who persecutes them earns only resentment and rebellion. Daily life in Cleopatra's Egypt. What was life like for ordinary Egyptians during Cleopatra's reign? For farmers, Life followed the ancient rhythms of the Nile. Plant during the flood season. Tend crops during the growth season. Harvest before the next flood. Pay your taxes in grain. Pray to the gods for good weather. In cities like Alexandria, Memphis, and Thebes, life was more cosmopolitan. Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, Syrian, and other communities lived side by side. Markets sold goods from across the known world. Indian spices, African ivory, Arabian incense, all available for those who could afford them. Slavery existed, as it did throughout the ancient world. But Egyptian slavery was different from the chattel slavery that would come later. Slaves could own property. They could marry free persons. They could, in some cases, buy their freedom. Many were more like indentured servants, working off debts or obligations. For women, Ptolemaic Egypt offered more opportunities than most ancient societies. Women could own property. They could conduct business. They could divorce their husbands. Legal documents from the period show women engaging in commercial transactions, filing lawsuits, and managing estates. Cleopatra herself was the ultimate example of this. In an age when most women were excluded from power, she ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world. The view from the palace. What was Cleopatra's daily life like? She woke in the royal palace, a magnificent structure overlooking the harbor of Alexandria. From her windows, she could see the lighthouse of Alexandria and the ships coming and going from the harbor. She started her day with meetings. Officials reported on tax collection, grain storage, military matters, and foreign affairs. She reviewed documents, signed decrees, and made decisions on policy. She gave audiences to foreign ambassadors, speaking to each in their own language. She held religious ceremonies when required. She dined with advisors and scholars, discussing philosophy, politics, and strategy. She spent time with her children. By the end of her life, she would have 4. Caesar Ion, her son with Julius Caesar, and 3 children with her next great love, Mark Antony. She was not just a queen. She was a mother, a scholar, a priestess, a general, and a diplomat. She carried the weight of an entire civilization on her shoulders. And for a time, she carried it well. But the peace wouldn't last. Rome's civil wars were far from over. And soon, Cleopatra will be drawn back into the deadly game of Roman politics. Rome after Caesar. Julius Caesar's assassination plunged Rome into chaos. The conspirators, who called themselves the liberators, claimed they had saved the Republic, but most Romans saw them as murderers. Caesar had been beloved by the common people. He had given them land, grain, and entertainment. He had won glorious victories. His death triggered riots in Rome. The conspirators were forced to flee the city. But Caesar's supporters were divided. His lieutenant Mark Antony claimed to be Caesar's political heir. But Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew Octavian arrived in Rome claiming that Caesar's will named him as adopted son and primary heir. Antony and Octavian initially competed for Caesar's legacy. They nearly went to war with each other. But then they realized their true enemies were conspirators who had killed Caesar. They joined forces with another of Caesar's supporters, Lepidus, forming the Second Triumvirate. Their first act was proscriptions. They drew up lists of their political enemies, who were declared outlaws. Anyone on the list could be killed, and the killer would receive a reward. Their property would be confiscated. It was a reign of terror that eliminated hundreds of Rome's leading citizens. Among those killed was Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and a staunch defender of the Republic. Soldiers cut off his head and hands and displayed them in the Forum. It was a message. Opposition would not be tolerated. The Battle of Philippi. In 42 BCE, the armies of the triumvirs met the armies of the liberators at Philippi in northern Greece. It was one of the largest battles of the Roman civil wars. Nearly 200,000 soldiers faced each other across the battlefield. The liberators had the larger force and the better position, but they were divided in command and strategy. Brutus, the most famous of Caesar's assassins, wanted to wait. Cassius wanted to attack. Their indecision proved fatal. The battle was actually two separate engagements fought weeks apart. The first was inconclusive, with both sides claiming victory. But in the second battle, Antony's forces broke through the liberators' lines. Cassius, mistakenly believing the battle was lost, committed suicide. Brutus fought on but was eventually defeated. He also took his own life rather than be captured. The last defenders of the Republic were dead. Rome now belonged to the triumvirs, the division of the world. After Philippi, Antony, and Octavian divided the Roman world between them, Lepidus received Africa but was effectively sidelined. He was never a major player. Octavian received the West, including Italy, Spain, and Gaul. He was young and untested in battle, but he was Caesar's heir and bore the name Caesar, which carried immense weight with Roman soldiers and citizens. Antony received the East, including Greece, Asia Minor, Syria, and oversight of Egypt. He was Caesar's former lieutenant, a skilled general, and popular with his troops. The East was the wealthier portion of the empire, with its ancient civilizations and profitable trade routes. But the eastern provinces needed to be organized and taxed to fund the triumvirs' armies. And Egypt, the wealthiest kingdom in the East, needed to be brought firmly into Rome's orbit. Antony decided to summon Cleopatra to meet him. He wanted to ensure her loyalty and extract financial support for his campaigns. He had no idea he was about to meet the one person who could match him in ambition, intelligence, and charisma. The meeting at Tarsus. In 41 BCE, Antony sent word to Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, a city in what is now southern Turkey. He was preparing for a campaign against the Parthian Empire, Rome's great eastern rival, and needed Egypt's support. Cleopatra delayed her arrival deliberately. She was no longer the desperate young woman who had smuggled herself to Caesar in a carpet. She was a queen in her own right, and she would arrive on her own terms. When she finally came, she came in spectacular fashion. Plutarch describes the scene in vivid detail. She sailed up the river Cydnus on a golden barge with purple sails. The oars were silver. The ship was perfumed with exotic scents that could be smelled from the shore. Cleopatra herself reclined under a canopy of gold cloth, dressed as the goddess Venus. Beautiful attendants, dressed as sea nymphs and cupids, attended her. Musicians played flutes and harps. It was a carefully orchestrated theatrical performance, designed to overwhelm and impress. The citizens of Tarsus lined the riverbanks to watch her arrival. Even Antony's soldiers abandoned their duties to see the spectacle. Antony had been holding court in the marketplace, but he found himself sitting alone. Everyone had gone to see Cleopatra. The seduction of Antony. Antony invited Cleopatra to dine with him. She replied that he should dine with her instead. He accepted. The banquet she prepared was legendary. The hall was decorated with lights, tapestries, and flowers. The food was exotic and abundant. The wine flowed freely. Entertainment was provided by musicians, dancers, and acrobats. It was a display of wealth and culture that even Rome, with all its power, could hardly match. Antony was impressed, but he tried to joke that he could match her display. The next night, he hosted a banquet for her, but his Roman feast, though expensive, seemed crude compared to her Egyptian elegance. Cleopatra had learned from her time with Caesar. Roman generals were pragmatic men, used in military camps and political forums. They were vulnerable to displays of culture, luxury, and refinement. These things suggested a world beyond war and politics, a world of pleasure and beauty. But Cleopatra offered more than luxury. She offered intelligent conversation. She spoke with Antony in his own language about military strategy, about politics, about philosophy. She matched his wit and challenged his thinking. She made him feel not just entertained, but understood. Antony was 42 years old. He had been married multiple times. He had campaigned from Gaul to Parthia. He had seen much of the world. But he had never met anyone quite like Cleopatra. He was, to use the ancient term, completely captivated. Antony's character, Marcus Antonius, known to history as Mark Antony, was a fascinating figure. He was physically impressive, tall and muscular, with the bearing of a soldier. Ancient statues show a strong-jawed face and intense gaze. He embodied Roman ideals of masculine virtue. He was an exceptional general. Under Caesar, he had commanded legions in Gaul and during the Civil War. He was brave in battle, sharing the hardships of his soldiers. They loved him for it. But he also had weaknesses. He was impulsive. He drank heavily. He was generous to the point of financial irresponsibility, showering gifts on friends and lovers. He made political promises he couldn't keep and military plans he couldn't execute. He was also deeply romantic. He fell in love easily and intensely. His previous marriages had been passionate but unstable. His relationship with his current wife, Fulvia, was stormy and political. In Cleopatra, he found someone who complemented him perfectly. She provided the strategic thinking and long-term planning he lacked. He provided the military might and Roman political connections she needed. Together, they would attempt to reshape the Roman world. But their relationship would also lead to disaster. The winter in Alexandria. Antony abandoned his plans to campaign against Parthia. Instead, he followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria. He spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE there, living in the royal palace. Ancient sources describe a season of extravagant parties and entertainment. Cleopatra and Antony formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, a group dedicated to enjoying life's pleasures. They held banquets, went hunting, played dice, and wandered the streets of Alexandria at night in disguise, playing pranks on citizens. But beneath the pleasure-seeking was serious political calculation. Antony needed Egypt's wealth for his campaigns. Cleopatra needed Antony's protection against other Romans who might threaten Egypt's independence. They formalized their alliance. Antony promised to support Cleopatra against her enemies. In return, she would provide financial support for his military campaigns. It was a partnership of mutual benefit. It was also, by all accounts, a genuine love affair. Cleopatra became pregnant with twins during this time. She would give birth to a son and daughter, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and moon. The return to Roman politics. Antony's extended absence from Roman affairs proved problematic. His wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius had raised rebellion against Octavian in Italy. When their revolt failed, Fulvia fled to Greece to find Antony. Antony was forced to leave Egypt. He met Fulvia in Athens, where she died shortly after. Some sources suggest she died of illness. Others hint at a broken heart, devastated by Antony's infidelity with Cleopatra. With Fulvia dead, Antony and Octavian mended their alliance. To seal the peace, Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia. It was a political marriage, designed to unite the two triumvirs. For Cleopatra, this must have been a difficult moment. The man she loved had married another woman. Her political ally was now tied to her potential enemy. She was alone again in Alexandria with their twin children. She focused on governing Egypt. She raised her children. She waited. She knew that Antony would return to her. Political marriages were common among Roman leaders. They rarely involved love. And she believed that what she and Antony shared was deeper than politics. She was right. Within a few years, Antony would return to the East. And when he did, he would commit himself to Cleopatra completely. Antony's Parthian campaign. In 36 BCE, Antony finally launched his long-planned campaign against the Parthian Empire. Parthia controlled what is now Iran, Iraq, and parts of Central Asia. They were Rome's only major rival, the one power that had successfully resisted Roman conquest. Parthia had defeated and killed Crassus, the third member of the First Triumvirate, in 53 BCE. They had humiliated Rome. Antony intended to avenge that defeat and win glory that would rival Caesar's conquests in Gaul. But the campaign was a disaster. Antony invaded with a massive army, perhaps 100,000 men, but his supply lines were overextended. The Parthians used their cavalry to harass his forces, attacking and then retreating before the Romans could respond. The harsh terrain and climate took a heavy toll. Antony was forced to retreat. He lost tens of thousands of soldiers. It was one of Rome's worst military defeats in decades. His reputation as a general was badly damaged. He retreated not to Rome, but to Alexandria, to Cleopatra, the donations of Alexandria. In 34 BCE, Antony held a magnificent ceremony in Alexandria that became known as the Donations of Alexandria. It was a pivotal moment that defined his relationship with Cleopatra and set him on a collision course with Octavian. In the ceremony, Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. He proclaimed that Caesarion was Julius Caesar's legitimate son and heir. This was a direct challenge to Octavian, who based his entire claim to power on being Caesar's heir. Antony then divided Rome's eastern territories among Cleopatra and their children. Cleopatra received Egypt, Cyprus, and parts of Syria and Lebanon. Their twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, now 6 years old, were given Armenia and Media. Their younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was given Syria and Asia Minor. It's important to understand what this meant. These weren't independent kingdoms. These were Roman territories, conquered by Roman legions. Antony was distributing Rome's empire as if it were his personal property, giving it to his foreign lover and their children. The ceremony was staged like a royal coronation, not a Roman triumph. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. The children wore the traditional garb of the territories they had been given. Alexander Helios dressed as a Median king. Cleopatra Selene as a Greek queen. It was spectacular theater, but to Romans it was outrageous. It looked like Antony was establishing a rival Eastern empire with Cleopatra as his queen. It looked like he was abandoning Rome for Egypt. Octavian's propaganda. Octavian saw his opportunity. He began a propaganda campaign against Antony that was masterful in its execution. He couldn't directly attack Antony, who was still popular with many Romans and commanded legions loyal to him. So instead, he attacked Cleopatra. Octavian portrayed Cleopatra as a foreign seductress who had enslaved Antony with her exotic charms. He called her a witch who used potions and spells. He spread rumors that she planned to rule Rome from Alexandria, that she wanted to destroy Roman civilization and replace it with Eastern decadence. He emphasized her foreignness. She was African, not Roman. She was a queen, not a citizen. She was a woman attempting to rule over men. All of these things played on Roman prejudices and fears. He claimed Antony had become effeminate, spending his time in luxury while neglecting his duties to Rome. He suggested Antony was no longer truly Roman, that he had become Egyptian in spirit, if not in blood. None of this was entirely true, but propaganda doesn't need to be true to be effective. Octavian understood that public opinion mattered. He was shaping the narrative, turning Antony and Cleopatra into villains threatening Rome itself. Antony's divorce. Antony's political marriage to Octavia had produced 2 daughters, but the relationship was always strained by his absence. Octavia had been patient and supportive, even raising Antony's children from previous marriages alongside her own daughters. But in 32 BCE, Antony officially divorced Octavia. It was a public rejection of Octavian's family and a declaration that his loyalty lay with Cleopatra, not with Rome's ruling family. The divorce shocked Rome. Octavia was beloved by the Roman people. She was seen as virtuous and loyal. Her treatment at Antony's hands generated sympathy. Octavian used this masterfully, presenting himself as a defender of his wronged sister. Antony responded with his own propaganda. He distributed writings explaining his actions. He emphasized that his relationship with Cleopatra was legitimate. He argued that he was expanding Roman power in the East, not abandoning Rome. But he was fighting a losing battle for public opinion. He was far away in Alexandria. Octavian was in Rome, controlling the message, and Romans were more inclined to believe their fellow Roman than a distant general who had married a foreign queen. The will of Antony. Octavian's next move was brilliant and ruthless. Roman tradition held that a man's will was sacred and private, but Octavian claimed to have obtained Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses who traditionally safeguarded such documents. Whether he actually had the real will or created a forgery is debated by historians, but Octavian read the will before the Senate. It contained provisions that infuriated the senators. The will stated that Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome. It reaffirmed that Caesarion was Julius Caesar's legitimate son. It left vast sums to his children with Cleopatra. To Roman senators, this confirmed their worst fears. Antony had abandoned Rome. He considered Alexandria his home. He recognized a foreign child as Caesar's heir. He was planning to establish a dynasty in Egypt that would rival Rome. The Senate, at Octavian's urging, stripped Antony of his powers and authority. They declared war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. This was politically clever. Romans were reluctant to fight other Romans. Civil war was traumatic and destructive, but a war against a foreign queen threatening Rome? That was acceptable. That was even patriotic. The gathering storm. Both sides began preparing for war. Antony and Cleopatra assembled a massive fleet and army. They had over 500 warships and perhaps 100,000 soldiers. They controlled the wealthy eastern provinces. They had the resources for a long war. Octavian had fewer ships and soldiers initially, but he had Rome's Italian heartland. He had the legitimacy of the Senate's declaration. And he had Marcus Agrippa, perhaps the finest admiral and general of the age. The showdown would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. Would Rome remain a republic, at least in name, centered in Italy, or would it become an Eastern empire, ruled from Alexandria by Antony and Cleopatra? The fate of Cleopatra's Egypt hung in the balance. If Antony won, Egypt would become the center of a new Roman empire. Cleopatra's children would rule vast territories. Her dynasty would be secured. If Octavian won, Egypt would likely become a Roman province. Cleopatra would lose everything. Her children would be at the mercy of her enemies. There was no middle ground, no possibility of negotiation or compromise. One side would triumph, the other would be destroyed. Life before the storm. In the months before the final confrontation, Antony and Cleopatra prepared for war while trying to maintain some semblance of normal life. They trained troops and built ships. But they also dined together, discussed strategy, and spent time with their children. Cleopatra was now about 37 years old. She had been queen for nearly 2 decades. She had navigated Roman civil wars, survived assassination attempts, and built Egypt into a prosperous and stable kingdom. But she had never faced a challenge like this. Antony was about 53. He had fought in dozens of battles. He had been Caesar's right hand. He had conquered territories and defeated enemies. But he had also made mistakes. The Parthian disaster haunted him. His reputation was not what it once was. Together, they formed a formidable partnership. Cleopatra provided strategic thinking and Egypt's resources. Antony provided military experience and command of Roman legions. Their children represented a potential dynasty that could unite the Roman and Egyptian worlds. But they also had weaknesses. They were geographically isolated from Rome. Many of Antony's Roman supporters were uncomfortable with his relationship with Cleopatra, and Octavian was proving to be a more capable opponent than they had anticipated. The final preparations. By the summer of 31 BCE, both sides were ready. Antony and Cleopatra moved their forces to the western coast of Greece, establishing their base at Actium. It was a strong defensive position with a natural harbor. Octavian's forces, commanded by Agrippa, blockaded them by sea. A land army, led by Octavian himself, blocked their retreat. Antony and Cleopatra were trapped. Antony wanted to fight a land battle. His legions were experienced and loyal. He believed he could defeat Octavian on land. But Agrippa's fleet controlled the sea. Antony's supply lines were cut. His army was slowly starving. Cleopatra argued for a naval breakthrough, used the fleet to break through the blockade, escape to Egypt, regroup and fight another day. It was risky, but staying trapped was certain defeat. They prepared for battle. The ships were readied. The soldiers were given their orders. Cleopatra's personal warship, with its purple sails and golden decorations, was made ready. She would fight alongside Antony, commanding part of the fleet herself. As the day of battle approached, both sides knew this would be decisive. The winner would control Rome and its empire. The loser would lose everything. The stage was set for the Battle of Actium, one of the most consequential naval battles in history. The Battle of Actium, on September 2nd, 31 BCE. The two fleets met off the coast of Actium. It was not the largest naval battle in ancient history, but it was certainly one of the most important. Antony and Cleopatra had about 230 warships. Many were massive vessels, heavily armored and towering over the water. They were impressive but slow and difficult to maneuver. Octavian and Agrippa had around 400 ships. They were smaller and lighter, but faster and more agile. Agrippa had trained his crews extensively. They knew how to work together, how to surround and overwhelm larger ships. The battle began in the morning. Antony's fleet moved out to engage. The ships were propelled by rows of oarsmen, dozens per ship. The air filled with the sound of drums keeping rhythm for the rowers, the shouts of officers giving commands, the crash of oars hitting the water. Agrippa's fleet moved to surround Antony's ships. They used fire arrows to set ships ablaze. They used rams to hold the enemy vessels. They avoided direct boarding actions, where Antony's larger ships would have the advantage. For hours, the battle raged. Ships burned, men drowned, the sea filled with wreckage and bodies. But no decisive advantage emerged. Antony's fleet was holding its own. Then, suddenly, Cleopatra's squadron, about 60 ships, raised their sails and fled. They broke through the line and headed south toward Egypt. The question of betrayal. What happened next has been debated for over 2,000 years. Ancient sources disagree. Modern historians argue. Did Cleopatra betray Antony? Or was her flight part of the plan? The traditional story, told by Octavian supporters, is that Cleopatra panicked. She fled in cowardice, abandoning Antony at the critical moment. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his own fleet and followed her like a lovesick fool, leaving his men to their fate. But this version was written by his enemies. They had reason to portray both Cleopatra and Antony in the worst possible light. A more likely explanation is that the flight was planned. The battle was not going well. Breaking through and escaping to Egypt was the only way to save their forces and fight another day. Cleopatra went first because her ships were fastest and carried Egypt's treasury, which they would need to continue the war. Antony followed shortly after with a few of his own ships. The plan may have been for the rest of the fleet to either break through as well or to surrender under favorable terms. But whatever the plan was, it failed. Antony's remaining ships fought on for hours before surrendering. His legions on shore, seeing their commander had fled, gradually deserted or surrendered to Octavian. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped, but they had lost their fleet their army, and their last realistic chance of defeating Octavian, the retreat to Alexandria. The journey back to Alexandria must have been agonizing. Cleopatra's ship sailed ahead. Antony followed, but reportedly refused to speak to anyone, even Cleopatra. Ancient sources say he sat alone at the front of the ship, head in his hands, overwhelmed by the disaster. When they reached Alexandria, they tried to maintain appearances. They held a ceremony celebrating Caesarion's coming of age. They reinforced the city's defenses. They sent messages to their remaining allies, asking for support. But both knew the truth. The war was lost. Octavian would come to Egypt. When he did, he would have overwhelming force. Antony and Cleopatra's reign was ending. Some of their allies deserted. Client kings sent messages to Octavian pledging loyalty. The rats were leaving the sinking ship. Cleopatra began preparing for the worst. She started building a mausoleum, a grand tomb where she could be buried. She collected treasures there, gold and jewels and precious items. Some sources suggest she was preparing for a dramatic final act, burning herself and Egypt's treasures rather than letting them fall into Roman hands. Antony sank into depression. He moved out of the palace and built a small house on a pier extending into the harbor. He called it his Timonium, after Timon of Athens, a legendary misanthrope who had rejected human society. Antony was withdrawing from the world, but occasionally his old spirit would return. He would rejoin Cleopatra in the palace. They would dine together, trying to recreate the joy they had once shared. But it was a shadow of their former life. The weight of impending doom hung over everything. Octavian's approach. Octavian took his time. He consolidated his control over the territories Antony had commanded. He secured the loyalty of the eastern provinces. He made sure no one would come to Antony and Cleopatra's aid. By the summer of 30 BCE, he was ready. His army marched on Egypt from the east and west simultaneously. His fleet blockaded Alexandria from the sea. Egypt was surrounded. Antony made a few half-hearted attempts at defense. He led a cavalry charge that scattered some of Octavian's advanced forces. For a moment, he was a warrior he had once been. He returned to Cleopatra, celebrating the small victory. They dined together, enjoying a brief respite from despair. But it was hopeless. Octavian's forces vastly outnumbered what Antony could muster. The next day, when Antony tried to engage again, his own troops deserted. They went over to Octavian without a fight. Even his personal bodyguard abandoned him. Antony fled back to Alexandria. He had nothing left. No army, no fleet, no allies. Only Cleopatra remained. The death of Antony. On August 1st, 30 BCE, Antony received news that Cleopatra was dead. The report said she had killed herself in her mausoleum. In his grief and despair, Antony decided to follow her in death. He asked his servant Eros to kill him. Eros, loyal to the end, instead killed himself rather than harm his master. So Antony took his own sword. He stabbed himself in the stomach, the Roman way of suicide. But he botched it. The wound was mortal but not immediately fatal. He collapsed, bleeding but conscious. Then came more news. Cleopatra was not dead. The earlier report had been false, a miscommunication, or possibly a deliberate ruse to get Antony away from her mausoleum. Servants came and found Antony dying. They carried him through the streets of Alexandria to Cleopatra's mausoleum, but the doors were sealed. Cleopatra had locked herself inside and refused to open them, fearing Octavian's soldiers might force their way in. So Antony was lifted up by ropes and pulleys through a window high in the mausoleum wall. Cleopatra and her 2 attending women pulled him up. Ancient sources describe the scene as heartbreaking. The once mighty general, reduced to a bleeding body being hauled through a window. He died in Cleopatra's arms. His last words, according to Plutarch, were to urge her to make peace with Octavian if she could do so with honor. He told her to trust Octavian's advisor Proculius, who he believed was honorable. Cleopatra was devastated. She tore her clothes. She beat her breast. She covered herself with his blood, the love of her life, the father of 3 of her children. Her partner in ambition was dead. She was alone now, facing Octavian and the might of Rome. Cleopatra's captivity. Octavian had no intention of letting Cleopatra die. She was too valuable. He wanted her alive for his triumph in Rome. Roman triumphs traditionally featured captured enemy leaders paraded through the streets in chains. Cleopatra would be the centerpiece of the celebration. He sent Proculius to negotiate with her. The man arrived at the mausoleum and spoke with Cleopatra through the barred door. She asked for guarantees of safety for her children. He made vague promises. While they talked, other soldiers scaled the building and entered through the same window Antony had been pulled through. They captured Cleopatra before she could kill herself. She concealed a dagger in her clothing, but they disarmed her. She was now Octavian's prisoner. She was allowed to remain in the mausoleum temporarily to oversee Antony's funeral. She performed the proper rituals, anointing his body with oils and arranging for his burial. She mourned him properly, as Egyptian custom demanded. Then she was moved to the palace, under guard. Octavian came to meet her. It was their first face-to-face encounter. The young man who had defeated her, the heir of Caesar who had destroyed Caesar's lover and their son's claims. The meeting was formal and cold. Cleopatra tried to plead her case. She presented accounts showing how much treasure she still controlled. She argued that her children should be spared, that they posed no threat to Rome. Octavian was noncommittal. He made no promises. He certainly didn't guarantee she would avoid being paraded in his triumph. Ancient sources suggest he intended exactly that humiliation for her. Cleopatra understood. She had seen Roman triumphs. She knew what they meant for captive rulers. She had watched her sister Arsinoe forced to walk in Caesar's triumph years earlier. She would not suffer the same fate. She began planning her final act, the death of Cleopatra. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra asked permission to visit Antony's tomb one last time. She was granted this request. She went to the tomb and made offerings. She spoke to Antony as if he could hear her. Ancient sources record her words, perhaps invented but emotionally true. She told him she would soon join him. She said she had been defeated not by Rome, but by fate. She asked him to wait for her in whatever afterlife awaited. She returned to the palace. She bathed and dressed in her royal regalia. She wore the traditional garb of an Egyptian pharaoh. She ordered a magnificent meal, the kind of feast she and Antony had once shared regularly. While she ate, a farmer arrived with a basket of figs. The guards inspected it, but saw only fruit. They let him bring it to Cleopatra. Hidden among the figs was an asp, a small venomous snake. After her meal, Cleopatra wrote a letter to Octavian. She asked to be buried beside Antony. Then she either held the snake to her breast or her arm. It bit her. The venom acted quickly. When Octavian's guards broke into the room, they found Cleopatra dead on her golden couch, dressed as a pharaoh. Her 2 faithful servants, Iras and Charmian, were also dying or dead from snake bites. Charmian was still arranging the crown on Cleopatra's head when the guards entered. One guard asked, "Is this well done?" Charmian's last words were, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings." Cleopatra had denied Octavian his triumph. She had chosen the manner and timing of her death. She had died as she had lived, on her own terms. She was 39 years old. Roman propaganda and reality. After Cleopatra's death, Octavian faced a challenge. He had defeated Antony and Cleopatra, but he needed to justify the war to the Roman people. Civil war was traumatic. Romans had killed Romans. Octavian needed to make it about something else. So he and his supporters created a narrative. They portrayed the conflict not as a civil war, but as a war of civilization against barbarism. Rome against Egypt, West against East, order against chaos. In this narrative, Cleopatra was the villain. She was a foreign queen who had seduced 2 of Rome's greatest men. She had used her beauty and magic to make them betray their homeland. She had planned to conquer Rome and rule from Alexandria. None of this was entirely true. Cleopatra had been defending Egypt's independence. She had formed alliances with Roman leaders because that was the only way to protect her kingdom. She had never intended to conquer Rome. She wanted to coexist with Rome as an equal partner. But propaganda doesn't need truth. Octavian's version of events became the official history. Later Roman writers repeated and embellished these claims. The historian Dio Cassius, writing 2 centuries later, described Cleopatra as practicing witchcraft. Poets like Horace and Virgil reference her as a dangerous foreign threat that Rome had narrowly defeated. This propaganda was so successful that it influenced how Cleopatra was remembered for centuries. Most ancient sources we have about her come from Roman writers who were hostile to her. They emphasize her relationships with Caesar and Antony while downplaying her own accomplishments. Early Christian interpretations. When Christianity became the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world, Cleopatra took on new meaning. Christian writers saw her as a symbol of worldly temptation and moral corruption. She became a warning about the dangers of female sexuality and power. Religious writers compared her to biblical figures like Jezebel or Delilah, women who had led righteous men astray. Her relationship with Antony was portrayed as lust rather than love, as sin rather than genuine emotion. This interpretation reflected the patriarchal values of late antiquity and the early medieval period. Women were supposed to be modest, obedient, and confined to domestic roles. Cleopatra, who had ruled an empire and commanded armies, violated all these expectations. But even in condemnation, there was fascination. Medieval manuscripts included stories about Cleopatra. She appeared in moral tales as an example of pride and vanity. But she was remembered, which is more than can be said for most ancient queens. Islamic perspectives. In the Islamic world, Cleopatra was remembered differently. Arab historians and writers knew her as an accomplished scholar and administrator. They emphasized her intellectual abilities and her skill in governance. Some Islamic sources describe her building projects and her contributions to learning. They remember her support for the Library of Alexandria and her patronage of scholars. She was seen as a learned queen, wise and capable. This more balanced view reflected different cultural values. In many Islamic societies, there were traditions of educated and politically active women. Female rulers were not unknown. So Cleopatra's combination of learning and political power was less shocking and more admirable. Medieval Arab writers also preserved and transmitted Greek and Roman texts that might otherwise have been lost. Through their work, knowledge about the ancient world, including about Cleopatra, was preserved and eventually returned to Europe during the Renaissance. Renaissance rediscovery. During the Renaissance, European scholars rediscovered ancient texts. They read Plutarch's biographies, which included detailed accounts of Antony and Cleopatra's lives. They studied other classical sources. Cleopatra returned to European consciousness. But the Renaissance interpretation was complex. On one hand, scholars admired classical civilization and wanted to understand it accurately. On the other hand, they still viewed history through Christian and patriarchal lenses. Artists began depicting Cleopatra. Paintings showed her death scene beautiful and tragic. Her image appeared on tapestries and frescoes. She became a popular subject for artistic representation. Writers used her story as material for literature. Cleopatra appeared in poems, plays, and histories. Each retelling emphasized different aspects. Some focused on her beauty, some on her cunning, some on her tragic end. The most famous Renaissance interpretation came from William Shakespeare. His play Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1606, would shape how English-speaking audiences understood the story for centuries. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is one of the most complex characters in his entire body of work. She is passionate, intelligent, manipulative, loving, and ultimately tragic. She is not simply a villain or a victim, but a fully realized human being with contradictions and depth. Shakespeare based his play primarily on Plutarch's biography of Mark Antony, translated into English by Sir Thomas North. But he added psychological insight and dramatic structure that made the story compelling for Elizabethan audiences. His Cleopatra is charismatic and powerful. She commands attention whenever she appears on stage. She matches wits with Antony. She schemes and plots. But she also genuinely loves him, and her grief at his death is portrayed as sincere and devastating. The play doesn't moralize as heavily as earlier Christian interpretations. Shakespeare presents Cleopatra's choices as understandable given her circumstances. She is trying to preserve her kingdom and protect her children. Her alliance with Antony makes strategic sense. Her decision to die rather than be paraded in triumph is portrayed as dignified, even noble. Shakespeare's famous line, spoken by Enobarbus about Cleopatra, captures her enduring charisma. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. This Cleopatra is not reduced to simple categories. She is infinitely complex, always surprising, impossible to fully understand or predict. The play influenced centuries of subsequent interpretations. It established certain images as canonical. The bard scene at Tarsus, the death by ASP, the tragic love story. These elements became fixed in popular imagination largely because of Shakespeare. Enlightenment rationalism. During the Enlightenment, European intellectuals tried to understand history more rationally and scientifically. They questioned traditional narratives and sought evidence-based interpretations. Some Enlightenment writers pushed back against the moralizing Christian interpretations of Cleopatra. They argued she should be judged by the standards of her own time, not by later Christian sexual morality. They emphasized her intelligence and political skill. The French philosopher Montesquieu wrote about how Cleopatra's nose, if it had been shorter, might have changed the entire course of history. This was a comment on how small factors can have large consequences, but also trivialize her accomplishments. She became a symbol of historical accident rather than historical agency. Other Enlightenment writers were more dismissive. They saw the ancient world as primitive and superstitious. They viewed Cleopatra's religious role as evidence of backward thinking. They couldn't appreciate how sophisticated ancient Egyptian civilization actually was. But some writers recognize her genuine accomplishments. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, acknowledged that Cleopatra had been an effective ruler who maintained Egypt's independence and prosperity during a turbulent era. 19th century Romanticism. The Romantic movement of the 19th century transformed Cleopatra once again. Romantic writers and artists were fascinated by passion, exoticism, and tragedy. Cleopatra embodied all three. She became a symbol of romantic love, the woman who would rather die than live without her beloved. Paintings depicted her death as beautiful and peaceful, surrounded by luxury and finery. The horror of snake venom and the reality of political defeat were aestheticized into tragic romance. The Orient, broadly defined, fascinated Romantic Europeans. Egypt was seen as mysterious and ancient. Cleopatra became a figure of Oriental exoticism, despite the fact that she was ethnically Greek and culturally Hellenistic. She was imagined as more Egyptian than she actually was, dressed in elaborate fantasies of Egyptian costume. This period also saw the beginning of modern Egyptology. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 included scholars who studied and documented ancient Egyptian sites. The Rosetta Stone, discovered during this expedition, allowed the decipherment of hieroglyphics. For the first time in over 1,000 years, Europeans could read ancient Egyptian texts. As knowledge of ancient Egypt increased, So did fascination with Cleopatra. She became a bridge between the ancient Egyptian past and the Hellenistic present. She represented the end of one world and the beginning of another. Writers like Théophile Gautier wrote novellas about her. Artists like Jean-Léon Gérôme painted elaborate scenes from her life. Operas were composed with her as the central character. She was everywhere in 19th century popular culture. Victorian moral complications. The Victorian era had complicated views about Cleopatra. On one hand, Victorians were fascinated by ancient history and archaeology. Cleopatra was part of that fascination. On the other hand, Victorian moral values were conservative, especially regarding women and sexuality. Cleopatra posed a problem. She was undeniably important historically, but she had had children outside of Christian marriage. She had been sexually active with multiple partners. She had wielded political power. All of these things violated Victorian ideals of proper womanhood. The solution was to simultaneously celebrate and condemn her. She could be admired as a historical figure while being condemned as a moral example. Victorian writers emphasized her beauty and her tragedy while downplaying her political and intellectual accomplishments. She became a cautionary tale about the dangers of female ambition and sexuality. Young women were warned not to be like Cleopatra, who had used her beauty for political ends and met a tragic fate. But even in this condemnation, there was admiration. Victorian audiences were drawn to her story. They attended plays and operas about her. They read novels featuring her. They viewed paintings of her. The fascination was undeniable, even if it had to be cloaked in moral disapproval. Early cinema and Hollywood. When cinema emerged in the early 20th century, Cleopatra was a natural subject. Silent films featured her story. The Italian film Marc Antonio e Cleopatra was released in 1913. Several other silent versions followed, but the most famous early cinematic Cleopatra was Cecil B. DeMille's 1934 film starring Claudette Colbert. This lavish production emphasized spectacle and romance. It portrayed Cleopatra as seductive and clever, using her charms to manipulate Caesar and Antony. The film was enormously successful and influenced how generations of Americans understood Cleopatra. It established certain visual tropes that would be repeated endlessly. The elaborate costumes, the exotic settings, the dramatic death scene. The most famous film version came in 1963, starring Elizabeth Taylor. It was one of the most expensive films ever made at the time. The production was troubled, running far over budget and schedule. But the final film was spectacular, with elaborate sets and costumes. Taylor's Cleopatra was glamorous and powerful. She portrayed the queen as intelligent and politically savvy, not merely seductive. The film emphasized Cleopatra's role as a ruler trying to protect her kingdom. It was more balanced than many earlier interpretations. The film also became famous for the off-screen romance between Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, who played Antony. Their real-life relationship mirrored the passionate and tumultuous relationship of their characters. Life and art blended together in the public imagination. These films shaped popular understanding of Cleopatra more than any historical text. Most people's mental image of Cleopatra comes from these cinematic portrayals, not from ancient sources or scholarly histories. Archaeological evidence. Modern archaeology has provided new insights into Cleopatra's world. Excavations in Alexandria have uncovered ruins of the ancient city, though much remains underwater due to earthquakes and subsidence. Underwater archaeology has discovered parts of the ancient harbor, including what maybe remains of the palace complex where Cleopatra lived. Statues, columns, and other artifacts have been recovered from the sea floor. They provide physical evidence of the magnificent city that was Cleopatra's capital. In other parts of Egypt, temples bearing Cleopatra's inscriptions have been studied. The Temple of Dendera with its famous relief of Cleopatra and Caesar Ion, shows how she presented herself to her Egyptian subjects. These images are not the exotic seductress of Roman propaganda, but a traditional pharaoh performing religious duties. Coins bearing Cleopatra's image have been analyzed. These show a woman with a prominent nose and strong features, not the conventional beauty of legend. Ancient beauty standards were different from modern ones, and Cleopatra's appeal was clearly not based solely on physical appearance. Documentary evidence has also been discovered. Papyri with administrative records from Ptolemaic Egypt show the workings of the government. Some bear notations that may be in Cleopatra's own handwriting, showing her direct involvement in administration. These archaeological discoveries help us understand the real Cleopatra beyond the myths. They show a working ruler engaged in the practical tasks of government, not just a romantic figure of legend. Her intelligence and education. One of Cleopatra's most remarkable qualities was her intellect. Ancient sources consistently emphasize this. Plutarch writes that her beauty was not incomparable, but her intelligence and conversation were captivating. Her linguistic ability was extraordinary. Speaking 9 languages in an era before modern language teaching methods required exceptional memory and dedication. It gave her a tremendous advantage in diplomacy and administration. She studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and rhetoric. These were not mere hobbies, but practical skills for a ruler. Mathematics was essential for managing finances and taxation. Astronomy was used for calendar keeping and agricultural planning. Philosophy provided ethical frameworks for decision-making. Rhetoric enabled persuasive communication. Ancient sources describe her debating with scholars and philosophers. She could discuss Platonic ideals or Aristotelian logic. She understood medical theories and geometric principles. She was, by any measure, one of the best-educated rulers of her era. This intellectual foundation informed her political strategy. She understood Roman politics because she studied it carefully. She knew how to appeal to different audiences because she understood rhetoric and psychology. She managed Egypt's economy successfully because she understood mathematics and administration. Her intelligence was not just academic. She had practical wisdom, what the Greeks called phronesis. She could assess situations, understand motivations, and make effective decisions. This combination of theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom made her a formidable leader. Political acumen. Cleopatra's political skills were exceptional. She took the throne at 18 in a highly unstable situation. Her brother's advisors opposed her. Egypt was heavily in debt to Rome. The kingdom's independence was threatened. Within a few years, she had secured her position, gained Roman backing, and stabilized the kingdom. This required careful political maneuvering, strategic alliance building, and effective administration. Her understanding of Roman politics was particularly impressive. Rome was a foreign culture with different values and power structures. But Cleopatra studied it carefully. She understood the ambitions of individual Roman leaders. She grasped the factional conflicts within Rome. She knew when to offer support and when to wait. Her alliances with Caesar and later Antony were strategic masterstrokes. Both men were powerful enough to protect Egypt, but also needed what Egypt could offer: wealth, grain, and a secure base in the eastern Mediterranean. The alliances were mutually beneficial, not simply seduction as Roman propaganda claimed. She also managed internal Egyptian politics skillfully. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always struggled to balance the Greek ruling class with the native Egyptian population. Cleopatra did this better than her predecessors by learning Egyptian, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and presenting herself as a true pharaoh, not just a Greek queen. Economic management. Egypt's economy under Cleopatra was sophisticated and productive. Agriculture was a foundation, with grain being the primary crop. But Egypt also produced papyrus, textiles, glass, and other manufactured goods. Cleopatra maintained royal monopolies that controlled key industries. This ensured steady revenue for the government. She reformed the currency to prevent debasement and maintain value. She managed grain storage and distribution to prevent famine. Trade was carefully regulated. Alexandria was one of the great trading cities of the ancient world. Goods from Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond passed through its ports. Taxes on this trade enriched the royal treasury. Cleopatra invested in infrastructure. Irrigation systems were maintained and improved. Harbors were expanded. The famous lighthouse of Alexandria was kept in good repair. These investments increased Egypt's productive capacity and economic output. Ancient papyri show that she personally reviewed tax assessments and economic policies. She wasn't a distant figurehead, but an engaged administrator who understood the details of economic management. The result was that Egypt remained prosperous throughout her reign. Despite the political turmoil and the demands of supporting her Roman allies militarily, Egypt's economy remained stable. This was no small achievement given the challenges of the era. Military leadership. Cleopatra is rarely thought of as a military leader, but she commanded forces on several occasions. She raised armies to fight her brother. She commanded part of the fleet at Actium. She understood military strategy and logistics. Her role was not as a battlefield commander in the traditional sense. She didn't personally lead cavalry charges or command infantry formations, but she understood strategy, managed logistics, and made command decisions. At Actium, her presence with the fleet was significant. She commanded her own squadron. Her ship carried much of Egypt's treasury. Her decision to break through the blockade, whether planned or improvised, was a command decision with major consequences. She also understood the importance of military logistics. Armies need food, water, equipment, and pay. Egypt's wealth allowed her to supply large forces. Her administrative skills ensured that supplies reached the troops who needed them. Her understanding of Roman military power informed her diplomatic strategy. She knew Egypt couldn't defeat Rome militarily. Her alliance strategy was based on this realistic assessment. She sought powerful Roman allies who could protect Egypt rather than trying to resist Rome directly. Religious role. Cleopatra's religious role was central to her identity as a ruler. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not just a political leader, but also a religious figure, the intermediary between the gods and the people. Cleopatra embraced this role fully. She participated in religious ceremonies. She made offerings at temples. She supported the priesthoods financially. She had herself depicted in traditional pharaonic religious iconography. She particularly identified with the goddess Isis. Isis was the most important goddess in the Egyptian pantheon, associated with motherhood, magic, fertility, and wisdom. By identifying with Isis, Cleopatra claimed these qualities for herself. The cult of Isis was spreading throughout the Mediterranean world during this period. In identifying with Isis, Cleopatra was connecting herself to a religious movement that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. It was brilliant religious diplomacy. She also participated in Greek religious ceremonies. The Ptolemaic dynasty had always maintained Greek religious practices alongside Egyptian ones. Cleopatra continued this tradition, honoring both pantheons. This religious flexibility served her political purposes. By honoring all gods, she honored all her subjects. Greek Alexandrians saw her participating in their religious festivals. Egyptian farmers saw her making offerings to Egyptian gods. Everyone could see themselves reflected in their queen. Personal life and character. Beyond her public roles, what was Cleopatra like as a person? Ancient sources give us some glimpses, though we must remember they were written by people with their own biases. She was clearly charismatic. Both Caesar and Antony were powerful, experienced men who had known many women. Yet both formed deep attachments to Cleopatra that went beyond political convenience. She must have possessed exceptional personal magnetism. Plutarch emphasizes her conversation and wit. She was entertaining, interesting, able to discuss many subjects. She could be charming and playful. The famous anecdote about her wagering with Antony that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single banquet, then dissolving a pearl in vinegar and drinking it, shows her flair for dramatic gestures. She was a devoted mother. Ancient sources describe her spending time with her children, overseeing their education, and including them in official ceremonies. When she died, her primary concern was for their safety. She could be ruthless when necessary. She likely ordered the death of her brother Ptolemy XIV to secure her position. In the ancient world, political rivals were often eliminated. She did what she needed to do to survive and protect her throne. She was passionate and emotional. Ancient sources describe her tearing her clothes and beating her breast in grief over Antony's death. Whether this is accurate or theatrical exaggeration, it suggests someone who felt deeply. She was also practical and calculating. Her decisions were based on rational assessment of political realities. She took calculated risks, like smuggling herself to Caesar in the carpet. She was not reckless, but strategic. Her legacy as a ruler. How should we assess Cleopatra as a ruler? By the standards of her time, she was remarkably successful. She maintained Egyptian independence for over 2 decades in an era when Rome was conquering the entire Mediterranean world. She stabilized a kingdom that had been in crisis when she took power. She managed the economy effectively. She maintained internal peace. She navigated the treacherous waters of Roman civil wars with skill. She ultimately failed in her goal of preserving Egyptian independence. But this failure was not due to her incompetence. She faced impossible odds. Rome was simply too powerful. No strategy, however brilliant, could have permanently prevented Rome from eventually absorbing Egypt. What's remarkable is how long she succeeded. From 51 BCE to 30 BC, she kept Egypt independent. She built alliances with the most powerful Romans of her era. She adapted to changing circumstances. She survived challenges that would have destroyed lesser rulers. Her reign represented the final flowering of Ptolemaic Egypt. Under her rule, Alexandria remained one of the great cities of the world. Egyptian culture continued to thrive. The economy prospered. It was, in many ways, a golden age before the fall. Comparison to other ancient rulers. How does Cleopatra compare to other famous rulers of antiquity? In terms of political skill, she ranked among the best. Her strategic thinking matched that of any contemporary ruler. Unlike many Hellenistic rulers, she genuinely cared about effective governance. She didn't simply extract wealth from Egypt. She invested in the kingdom's infrastructure and economy. She balanced the needs of different populations within her diverse realm. Her linguistic and cultural adaptability was unique. Most ancient rulers remained firmly within their own cultural traditions. Cleopatra moved fluidly between Greek, Egyptian, and Roman contexts. This flexibility was a tremendous asset. Her greatest weakness was military. She lacked the personal military reputation of rulers like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. In an age when military prowess was central to political legitimacy, this was a significant disadvantage. But she compensated by forming alliances with militarily powerful Romans. This was a realistic strategy given Egypt's military limitations. She understood her strengths and weaknesses and acted accordingly. The woman behind the legend, stripping away the layers of myth and propaganda, who was the real Cleopatra? She was a highly intelligent, well-educated woman who became queen at a young age and ruled effectively for over 2 decades. She was politically astute, economically savvy, and diplomatically skilled. She was passionate and emotional, but also calculating and practical. She loved deeply, but also understood that personal relationships had political dimensions. She was not the exotic seductress of Roman propaganda. She was not simply a victim of circumstance. She was not a feminist icon by modern standards, nor was she a villain by ancient ones. She was a complex human being navigating an extraordinarily difficult historical moment. She made bold choices and took calculated risks. Some paid off brilliantly. Others failed disastrously. She experienced great triumphs and crushing defeats. She loved and lost. She ruled and fell. In the end, she chose death over humiliation. That final choice defined how history would remember her. She denied her enemies the satisfaction of parading her in chains. She maintained her dignity to the very end. This was Cleopatra, scholar, queen, mother, lover, politician, and legend. Understanding her requires looking beyond the myths to see the real woman who shaped history in one of its most turbulent eras. Literature through the ages. Cleopatra has inspired more literary works than perhaps any other historical woman. From ancient times to the present, writers have been fascinated by her story. The earliest literary references come from Roman poets writing during or shortly after her lifetime. Horace, Propertius, and Virgil all mention her, usually in hostile terms reflecting Roman propaganda. But even in condemning her, they acknowledge her importance and impact. Medieval writers included her in moral tales and historical chronicles. She appeared in Dante's Inferno, placed in the circle reserved for the lustful. This reflected medieval Christian interpretations of her story as a cautionary tale about sexual sin. Renaissance and Elizabethan writers found her story rich material for drama. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is the most famous, but many other playwrights tackled the subject. John Fletcher, Samuel Daniel, and others wrote plays about her. 18th and 19th century writers continued the tradition. John Dryden's All for Love reimagined the story with a focus on tragic romance. George Bernard Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra offer more intellectual interpretation, emphasizing the relationship between the older statesman and the young queen. 20th century literature brought new perspectives. Writers from colonized nations saw Cleopatra as a figure of resistance against imperialism. Feminist writers emphasized her agency and political skill. Post-colonial theorists examined how her story had been distorted by European and male perspectives. Contemporary fiction continues to explore her story. Historical novels by writers like Margaret George and Stacy Schiff offer detailed, research-based portrayals. These works attempt to recover the historical woman from layers of myth, art, and visual culture. Visual artists have been depicting Cleopatra for centuries. Each era has imagined her according to its own aesthetic values and cultural concerns. Ancient coins and sculptures provide the only contemporary images. These show a woman with strong, distinctive features, dressed in royal regalia. They are not idealized beauties, but representations of political authority. Medieval illuminated manuscripts sometimes included images of Cleopatra, usually showing her death scene. These images reflected medieval artistic conventions rather than any attempt at historical accuracy. Renaissance and Baroque artists created elaborate paintings of Cleopatra. The death scene was particularly popular. Artists portrayed her in various states of undress, supposedly dying from the ASP bite. These paintings were often more about showcasing female beauty than historical representation. The 19th century saw an explosion of Cleopatra imagery. Orientalist painters depicted her in fantastical settings with elaborate costumes and exotic details. These paintings reflected European fantasies about the East more than Egyptian realities. The Art Nouveau and Art Deco movements embraced Egyptian motifs, and Cleopatra became a popular subject. Artists depicted her in stylized, decorative compositions that emphasize luxury and exoticism. Modern and contemporary artists continue to engage with Cleopatra's image. Some deconstruct the myths and stereotypes. Others reclaim her as a symbol of female power or African heritage. The image remains contested and meaningful. Music and opera. Cleopatra has inspired numerous musical works. Opera composers found her story ideal for dramatic treatment, with its combination of romance, politics, and tragedy. The earliest surviving opera about Cleopatra is Handel's Giulio Cesare, Julius Caesar, premiered in 1724. This Baroque opera focuses on the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra. It portrays her as clever and resourceful, using her intelligence as much as her beauty. Many other Baroque and classical composers wrote operas about Cleopatra. The story's combination of historical importance and dramatic potential made it attractive for operatic treatment. The 19th century saw more Cleopatra operas. Composers were drawn to the exotic settings and passionate emotions. The death scene provided a perfect opportunity for dramatic soprano arias. The most famous musical work about Cleopatra in the 20th century is Samuel Barber's Antony and Cleopatra, commissioned for the opening of the new Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center in 1966. Based on Shakespeare's play, it emphasized the tragic dimensions of the story. Popular music has also engaged with Cleopatra. Songs reference her as a symbol of beauty, power, or seduction. She appears in rock songs, pop ballads, and hip-hop tracks. The references are usually brief, but indicate her continued presence in popular consciousness. Why she still matters. 2,000 years after her death, Cleopatra remains culturally significant. Why does she still capture imagination? Why do we still tell her story? Partly because her life was genuinely dramatic. The historical facts, stripped of all embellishment, are remarkable. A young woman becomes queen of a wealthy kingdom. She forms alliances with the most powerful men of her age. She nearly reshapes the political landscape of the Mediterranean. She chooses death over submission. It's inherently compelling, partly because she challenges assumptions. She was a woman with power in a patriarchal world. She was African ruling in an era of European expansion in later tellings. She was Eastern confronting Western imperialism. Different groups see different challenges to different assumptions in her story, partly because she's endlessly interpretable. The historical evidence is extensive but incomplete. This leaves room for imagination. Writers, artists, and filmmakers can fill the gaps differently, creating new versions while remaining loosely faithful to known facts, partly because she represents timeless themes: love and politics, power and mortality, success and failure, individual agency against historical forces. These themes resonate across cultures and eras, partly because her story asks important questions about gender and power, about cultural difference and conflict, about how we remember and why. These questions remain relevant. Her story provides a framework for exploring them. Finally, because she chose to be remembered, her dramatic life and death ensured historical attention. She made herself unforgettable, and having captured history's attention, she has never released it. The final word. As we reach the end of this long journey through Cleopatra's life and legacy, what final thoughts emerge? Cleopatra was a real person who lived in a specific time and place. She was born in 69 BCE in Alexandria. She became queen at 18. She ruled for 21 years. She formed alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She had 4 children. She died by her own hand in 30 BC at age 39. These are facts. They are knowable, documentable, historically certain. But Cleopatra has also become something beyond the historical person. She has become a symbol, a legend, a mirror in which different eras see their own concerns reflected. She has been interpreted and reinterpreted endlessly. She has been condemned as a wicked seductress and celebrated as a powerful queen. She has been claimed as white, black, and everything between. She has been portrayed as victim and villain, fool and genius, romantic and pragmatist. All of these interpretations capture something. None captures everything. The real Cleopatra, the woman who actually lived, remains partially hidden behind centuries of interpretation. But perhaps that's appropriate. Cleopatra was many things in life. She was Greek and Egyptian. She was scholar and ruler. She was mother and lover. She was practical and passionate. Why should memory be simpler than reality? What we can say with certainty is that she was extraordinary. She ruled effectively in an era of chaos. She navigated impossible political situations with intelligence and courage. She made bold choices and accepted their consequences. She left a legacy that endures 2 millennia after her death. She was the last Pharaoh of Egypt, the last independent ruler before centuries of foreign domination, the final flowering of Ptolemaic civilization, the bridge between the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. She was Cleopatra VII Philopator, Queen of Egypt, beloved of her father, and she changed history. Closing. And so we come to the end of our journey through the life of the most powerful queen Egypt has ever known, from her birth in Alexandria to her dramatic death in that same city, from her brilliant education to her sophisticated rule, from her alliances with the greatest Romans to her final defiance of Rome itself. We have explored not just her life, but her legacy, how she has been remembered, interpreted, and reimagined through 2,000 years, how she has inspired literature, art, music, and film, how she has become a symbol with meanings that shift with each generation. Through it all, one thing remains constant. Cleopatra fascinates us. She challenges us. She makes us think about power, gender, culture, and history. She refuses to be simple or easily categorized. Perhaps you've learned something new tonight. Perhaps you've seen a familiar story in a new light. Perhaps you've simply enjoyed a few hours of calm, measured storytelling about one of history's most remarkable figures. As you drift off now, comfortable and relaxed, remember that learning never truly ends. Every story we hear, every piece of knowledge we absorb, becomes part of who we are. History isn't just about the past. It's about understanding ourselves and our world. Cleopatra's story reminds us that individuals can shape history, that intelligence and courage matter, that boldness can pay off, even when ultimate victory proves impossible, that how we face our challenges and even our defeats defines our legacy. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, you spent these hours learning about one of the most fascinating figures in all of human history, the last Pharaoh of Egypt, the Queen of Kings, Cleopatra. Good night.